boring. Okay, we're talking about eyewitnesses. And there is a problem with eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony, of course, is sometimes considered not very accurate. There are mistaken identities that happen all the time. You would think that a woman who is being sexually molested, who is being raped, would be able to identify her attacker. But case after case after case, we see instances where DNA exonerates the individual that she implicates, as strange as that may seem. Or maybe it's not so strange. How many people claim that all black people look alike? Well, if she was sexually molested by an African American, and she thinks that all black men look alike, how in the world can she possibly pick a select African American gentleman out of a lineup of African American gentlemen? Right? And this is a problem. People don't even think about other groups of individuals. When they pass them on the street, they don't even look at each other. This is very common in the South. That is so crooked. Jurors put a great deal of weight on testimony from an eyewitness, and this is kind of unfortunate because sometimes they're inaccurate. Often they're inaccurate. All right. We'll come the other way. There we go. Okay. All right. Loftus in 1974 gave subjects a description of an armed robbery resulting in 2 deaths. Death seems to be really important. If it's death, it's a capital crime. Therefore, we try to solve those cases far more readily than other cases. 18% of those presented with only circumstantial evidence against the defendant convicted him. 72% convicted when an eyewitness ID was presented to, along with all the circumstantial evidence. So, as you can see, the eyewitness was very, very important. The fact that this individual thought that they saw this individual. Now, the interesting thing is, we've talked about this before, but the interesting thing is most crimes are committed at night. At night, it's not very light outside. And we saw that, the picture of the pregnant lady with the skirt, with the gray skirt and the black top, who was barefoot. And how many of us could identify all the aspects of this lady? Could we have picked her out of a lineup? We saw her from, 10 or 15 feet. Could we have identified her? And the answer is potentially no. She looks like a lot of different people. From far away, she looks like a lot of, including half the people in this classroom. Because she did have dark hair, and everybody in here has dark hair. But it was kind of long, so could have been you, could have been, I don't know, your hair's up, so. Steph's the only one that, your hair's too short, sorry. Couldn't have been you. Of course, she was pregnant, and she was holding her stomach. That's how we knew she was pregnant. Otherwise, I'm not exactly sure we would have been able to identify her. Jurors have a baseline expectation that eyewitnesses are accurate. The idea is that if you see something, obviously you know about that thing. You can identify that select individual. Jurors assume that eyewitnesses' testimony is a reflection of their memory quality and not the way that they were questioned or interacted with in the lineup by the lineup administrator. And this, of course, is a fundamental attribution error. We need to recognize that eyewitnesses' memories are not perfect. We fill our memories in. We don't remember everything exactly the way it happened. Jurors over rely on an eyewitness's confidence when gauging accuracy, and of course that can be a problem. Jurors could be informed about whether investigators follow the Department of Justice guidelines for conducting lineups. Eyewitness testimony could be limited. These are safeguards against mistaken identification. Allow psychologists who are knowledgeable about the research on perception and memory to testify. Of course, then nobody will believe any eyewitness. Now, we can look at this from two different perspectives. The perspective of the person that's being led, or defending themselves, and the prosecutor. If we have an eyewitness, and the eyewitness claims that that's the person, is that correct or is that incorrect? Well, it all depends on which side of the bars you're sitting on. As far as the defendant is concerned, that's absolutely incorrect. As far as the prosecution is concerned, that's absolutely correct. So this gets to be a real toss-up. You can imagine if a relative of yours was murdered, and there was an eyewitness that saw who it was, and that person went to court, and they were pointed out as the individual that committed the crime, and then they were let go because people said, well, you know, eyewitness accounts, they are very rare, they're very often inaccurate. How would you feel if your relative was murdered and the individual that did it was exonerated because they didn't believe the eyewitness? What if you were the eyewitness and you saw the person doing it and you thought you knew who that person was? I know. However, what if you were the relative of the individual that was supposed to have killed the individual? I've got a friend that comes to my house from time to time. His son's in jail. They keep moving him around for murder. And he claims that his son didn't do it, of course. His son claims that he didn't do it. And the person that fingered him, he says he's the one that did it. So, I know, it's kind of an interesting conversation. And what can I say to him? He wants me to make a decision as to whether his son actually murdered the young lady or not. I know. So he comes over to my house trying to get me to admit and reopen the case. I don't have anything to do with this case. This is a federal case. Well, actually, yeah, it's a federal case. It's a federal case. They moved him from, he used to be down south of Phoenix. Isn't there a prison somewhere down there? Okay. Then they moved him out to California. Now he's in upper New York State. So they just keep moving him around.
Why? That's a lot of gas money.
You mean to move him around?
Yes.
They're having problems with jails for not run by the state. You know, private jails. They're putting people in private jails. Okay, that's what happened. I guess the one here is a federal prison, and the one out in California was a for-hire prison. And then they moved him out to New York State because they needed another federal prison. They closed the one in California. I don't know, stupid stuff. Anyway, so his mother's complaining, she never gets to see him, that kind of stuff. So what are they going to do? Is he guilty or not? Well, I don't know if he's guilty or not. Only he knows if he's guilty or not. He's been convicted, so I guess he is guilty because that's what the feds say he is. Will he ever be exonerated? Well, with prayer and whatnot, I guess he'll be exonerated. Well, that's the idea. I don't know if that works or not. Jurors could be informed about whether investigators follow the Department of Justice guidelines for conducting lineups. Eyewitness testimony could be limited. We could allow psychologists who are knowledgeable. We've already talked about all that stuff. Okay, ooh, look at her. Judges could instruct juries about potential eyewitnesses, weaknesses of eyewitnesses' IDs, and suggest how to interpret this testimony. Judges could limit eyewitness testimony, and this is what seems to be happening now. They are limiting the eyewitness testimony. The judge has to decide whether to allow the eyewitness testimony. It was dark. I was 20 feet away. If you watch the movies, if you see television shows, a lot of times it has to do with how well do you see. Do you have 20/20 vision? Do you have 20/10 vision? Do you require glasses? Were you wearing your glasses when you saw this individual? Can you positively identify them? For example, a judge could rule that due to the particular eyewitness conditions in a case, portions or all of the eyewitness testimony will not be admissible. And that's normally what's happening these days, because there are so many people that are talking about eyewitness accounts. Now, this is okay if you're the defendant, but if you're the prosecutor or you're the family of the individual that was murdered, and you have an eyewitness that saw this person, and you can identify that person, and the judge won't allow it to go to court, won't allow it to be the testimony to be, he's ruled it inadmissible. How does that make you feel? Does that piss you off? You've got somebody that saw the person doing it, and they can identify them, but they won't let them testify. Would that make you upset? Well, of course it would. Yeah, sure it would. You would assume that the individual was guilty. And now they may get off, or they may just get, a slap on the wrist, or whatever. Involuntary. No, they wouldn't do that, because then they have to positively identify them. They'll get off. Expert testimony. The expert's task is to provide the jury with a scientifically based frame of reference within which to evaluate the eyewitness's evidence. Does not tell the jury what to believe about a particular eyewitness or whether the eyewitness is accurate. They're not really giving them that kind of information. What they're doing is they're saying, well, this may not be accurate testimony. This eyewitness may be mistaken. Expert testimony tends to sensitize jurors to problems in witnessing and identification procedures. So if you watch these things on television or you hear of them, a lot of times both sides will bring in their own experts. From time to time, it all depends on the state we're dealing with, the court will bring in their own experts, and those experts will be the only ones allowed to testify. In the case of O.J. Simpson, his murder trial, he brought in his own experts that said that it couldn't possibly have been him. I think he's left-handed, and the person slit Ronald Goldman's throat from left to right. Okay. So what you do when you slit somebody's throat is you come up behind them and you grab them by the top of the head, and you hold their head tight, and then if you're right-handed, you cut from left to right. Okay. If you're left-handed, you cut from right to left. Okay. I'm teaching you guys how to cook them. But you have to grab them by the head and tighten up the muscles, otherwise it doesn't really work very well.
And it's all on tape.
It's all on tape.
And it's all on tape.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's on tape. Oh, great. Okay, that's the last time I'm going to tell you guys how to kill somebody. Thank you, it's on tape. Okay.
Give yourself away now.
In 1976, the wealthy Hannigans caught 3 illegal Mexicans, aliens on their property. They tortured them and then they chased them back across the border. And these are the 3 Mexicans that they tortured. Now, I don't know how legal torture is. These are illegal aliens. Can you just torture somebody that's not supposed to be here? Is that legal? No. Okay, well, something happened. They were tried in the same court. There were the 2 brothers and the dad. But the 2 brothers were implicated because they were the ones doing the torturing. So Thomas and Patrick Hannigan were given simultaneous trials. At one trial, Thomas was allowed expert witnesses. He had an expert witness. Patrick was not, and Patrick was convicted, and Thomas was acquitted. The
Wait.
reason,
Both of them are brothers, Patrick and Thomas. Right?
yeah,
Why was Patrick convicted but Thomas was acquitted?
because Thomas was allowed an expert witness. They had different judges. This is in Texas. Okay, it gets worse. It gets worse. Sure, he was convicted. You know how long he spent in prison?
2 days.
I don't know, about 6 months. By the time the trial was over with, he'd already served his time. So both of them were let go. I know, but they were both rich. Okay. So rich people get away with stuff. Remember Trump said that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and nobody would care. He wouldn't be convicted. Well, we got a smoking gun right now. We got transcripts of what he said. So we'll see what happens with this impeachment thing. This is really kind of fascinating. Because the transcript that they allowed us to read yesterday, nothing compared. He had 8 conversations with this guy, and this is the nicest one. So the rest of them are going to be worse. So we'll see if he can get away with trying to bribe a government into. I know.
I saw that the process of impeachment is going on,
Yeah.
and I saw he was in total shock about it, and I'm like, really? Like, were you really that shocked about it?
Yeah. Sure he's shocked, because he thinks he can shoot somebody and get away with it. So, yes. And he's been doing this forever. Money allows you to do just about anything you want, to get away with just about anything. Unless you're Jeffrey Epstein, and he was doing some god-awful things, and he got away with it for decades. For decades. And then they finally caught him twice. The first time they just kind of slapped him on the wrist and let him go. And this was trafficking and statutory rape. And he was able to get away with it because he's rich. And he owns an island and 2 jet airplanes. If you don't think these things are important, then you've never had 2 jet airplanes and owned your own island, obviously. Because you can get away with anything you want. Those of us who have been middle class all of our lives, we don't understand this stuff. We'll keep an eye on the clock.
Yeah.
Okay. Defense sometimes requests that jurors be alerted to the limitations of eyewitnesses. The judge decides whether to grant the request. What effects do cautionary instructions have on jurors' beliefs about eyewitness accuracy? Not much. Juries believe somebody that said they saw something. They believe it. Is there a problem with their memory? Well, we assume that everybody else's memory is just as perfect as ours is. Everything that we remember is accurate. We know it is because it's our memory. So we assume that their memory is just as good as ours is. The Telfair instruction reduced mock jurors' sensitivity to eyewitness evidence, probably because the instruction gave little indication how jurors should evaluate the evidence. And of course, that's the Telfair instruction. The Telfair instruction is only used in select states. The Telfair instruction says eyewitness testimony is not always accurate. And you need to decide whether it is accurate or not. As strange and confusing as that is. These findings provide some hints about the type of jury instruction that could reduce the likelihood of mistaken convictions in eyewitness cases. Those instructions, as yet untested, are likely to be issued specific, tailored to the facts present on a particular case, and based on scientific research findings. Now, we're talking about eyewitnesses as if they're all, none of them are accurate. That's the way we're talking about this. If this were a law class, we wouldn't be talking about it like this. If this were a law class, I would be telling you that you need to find as many eyewitnesses as you possibly can. You need to get all the information that you can from all those eyewitnesses and put it all together, and that's how you win a case. If you have an eyewitness, it's a lockdown. You've got it. It's 100% you're going to win your case. That's what I would be telling you. This sounds like it's a 50-50 shot, whether they were accurate or inaccurate. But that's not the way it works. And the reason I'm talking about it like this is because this is a psychology class, not a law class. And in the law, if you have an eyewitness, it's pretty much, the case is pretty much over with. And like I said before, a lot of individuals can't identify their attacker. It isn't because their attacker is attacking from behind them. It's because a lot of people don't want to look at their attacker. And if they do look at their attacker, they're not looking at specifics. They're too scared. so they can't identify their attacker. Okay. Children over the age of 6 can make reasonably reliable identifications from lineups, provided that the perpetrator is actually in the lineup and the child had extended contact with the perpetrator. We're going to talk about child evidence right now. The reality is, if the child is younger than 6 years old, probability... If they're younger than 6 years old, the probability of it being accurate is fairly remote. 6-year-olds are the ones that believe that Barney is real, that that their toys can actually move. So it gets really difficult. There was a case in Las Vegas. This lady allowed her neighbor to babysit her daughter. Her daughter was 18 months old. This individual not only molested the child, but he videotaped it. He videotaped it, and evidently, well, the videotape was an hour and a half long. So he was molesting his child for an hour and a half, and you would think that the child would remember that. She's 18 months old. The whole reason that anybody found out about this is because the videotape started circulating in Las Vegas. Somebody had it and they said, oh, I found it out in the desert. Yeah, right. They found it out in the desert and they turned it into the police. So the police, the guy was really cagey as to how he videotaped the child. He didn't videotape the child's face. He didn't videotape his face. What he videotaped was him molesting the child. And of course, this thing went on for an hour and a half. So the cops got a hold of it, and of course everybody is really upset. So they start a nationwide manhunt trying to figure out. And they had the FBI came in, they looked at the tape, and they identified various things about the tape. They were able to identify the building that it was in. They were, but they weren't exactly sure who the child was. This is a huge apartment building in Las Vegas. But they weren't able to identify the child until they identified the child's clothes. The child had on, clothes from Kmart. I mean, Kmart clothes. In April, they made these, they were selling these clothes. So they were able to identify the child's clothes. They were able to identify what floor they were on because he showed scenes out the window. So they knew that they were on the 5th floor. They were able to isolate it that way. Eventually they figured out who the child was. And then they, of course, questioned the mother, and she had no idea what was going on. No, I never let anybody be around my daughter unless I'm there. Oh, wait a minute, 5 months ago, I had an appointment, and I asked my neighbor if he could watch my daughter, and I was only gone for an hour or so. She's been on for a couple hours. But, and then they went to the daughter. They went to the little 18-month-old. By this time, the child was almost 3 years old. She was 2.5, 3 years old. And they asked her about the incident, and she had no memory of it whatsoever. None whatsoever. She had no idea what they were talking about. You can tell yourself that she was repressing the memories, but that's not what the psychologists determined. They determined that she was too young to have verbal memories of what happened to her. So she just didn't have any memories of it at all. People don't have memories. We don't remember what happened to us when we were only a year and a half old. We don't remember what happened to us before the age of, we may remember kindergarten, but do we remember when we were 3? And the answer is not very much, if anything at all. So, there you go. That's the good news, because the child didn't remember anything.
Question.
Yes.
If the child does not have a memory, at some point in time, I know this is most likely stored in the subconscious. At some point in time, will this child begin to act out or have any side effects at all?
They shouldn't. They shouldn't. Because they have no memory. And you said that it's probably in their subconscious. It's probably not in their subconscious.
No?
I mean, well, how do we put things in our memories? We put them as pictures and we put them as words. And if she doesn't remember, she didn't have words at the time
Right.
to put those memories in her mind, so she can't really identify, even if she has pictures of it, she can't really identify what it was. I know.
That's good for her.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, and that's one of the things that came out of that situation. They decided that it was not a bad thing. Eventually, of course, they caught the guy. He realized that it was a friend of his that had the tape, and it was a friend of his that turned in the tape. Then the guy said, "Hey, look, I turned that tape in. That was really gross, and you know, you're not my friend anymore." That kind of thing. So the guy took off across country. They caught him in Alabama, I think. Anyway, they caught him. Don't worry about it. They caught him.
So how can some of us explain something that happened when I was 3 years old? I can still remember certain things.
If you can put words to it, then probably you can remember it. I can remember
Because,
when I was 18 months old, but all I remember was being picked up by my mother. My mother was really short. She's only 4'8". But I was in a nightgown. My mother had put me in a nightgown. I came running down the stairs, and she picked me up, and I was in a nightgown. And it didn't seem odd to me because I'm a year and a half old. What do I know about nightgowns? But I remember that. So if you can remember something from 3 years old, that's kind of logical because you did have words at that point. We can remember pictures.
so if you can't speak, then you don't have memory.
If you can't put words to it, then how do you remember? You remember it as pictures. We've been debating this for centuries as to whether babies can remember things. In the 19th century, people didn't care whether kids could remember or not, because children weren't that important. They weren't important until they became adults. So they thought of children as young adults. But things have changed, and now we care. So now we're investigating these things and trying to figure out what happens next. For the longest time, there was no child abuse. There was no such thing as child abuse. You could do anything you wanted to a kid. You could kill them if you wanted to. Nothing would happen. It's just the way it worked. They didn't have any laws to try you by. And then, of course, at the turn of the 20th century, we did start prosecuting child abuse cases. We started removing children from parents. At that point, there were these massive orphanages all over the place. And of course, the orphanages were necessary because parents died. And if the parents died, who's going to take care of the kid? Well, there was no way to take care of the kid. A lot of these people were immigrants, so they didn't have extended family. Or if they did have extended family, they were in the old country. So they had these huge orphanages. When I was growing up, there was an orphanage about 3 miles down the road from my house. I lived on a farm, but it was down about 3 miles away, and the place was always packed. And that's because there were, mom died in childbirth, and dad didn't want to take care of the kids, so they just took them and dropped them off at the orphanage. It was packed. The place was always full. And strangely, there was a bread factory right next door to the orphanage, so they got free bread. If the loaf kind of messed up, they'd give them the bad loaf. So they always got fresh bread, I was jealous because it smelled so good. I wanted to be an orphan.
I bet it was.
And my mother wanted me to be an orphan. So she was willing to take me down there. As a matter of fact, she told me that several times.
Well, there are those days we feel like dropping our kids off somewhere
Yeah, somewhere. Well,
and fading into the sunset.
oh, and they were always playing games out front. It looked like a great place to go.
Oh, yeah.
all those kids to play with. Children are generally less accurate than adults when making an identification from a lineup in which the suspect is absent. They pick someone else, of course. They have false positive errors. This is a problem. And depending on how old they are. Before they reach puberty, of course, they're not looking at the same things that adults are looking at before puberty. If you remember if you have a child, remember when they were 6 years old, they identified people by the color of their clothes. It didn't have anything to do with their hair, it didn't have anything to do with their race. They had no clue about race. Potentially they had no clue about race. They identified kids by the color of their outfits.
Well,
I like
oddly
the little green
enough,
girl, she was fun.
being the senior of the class, and I don't mean in class-wise either.
I'm the
Uh,
senior in the class, okay?
You are not, because I'm older than you are.
I'm 70.
I'm 72, I'll be 73 the
You
next
beat me,
month.
you're the senior in the class. You should be teaching.
I grew up in a small West Texas town, and I never knew there was such a thing as race until I graduated high school and became part of the outside world. Our community was small, and there was a section.
What is this town?
Pardon?
What's the name of the town?
Snyder.
Snyder, oh, well, we've already had this conversation. I swear my ex-wife is.
Now?
Now.
Is she teaching or what?
No, my God, no. No, she lives in Snyder with a one-armed mechanic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his name's Ramirez. Do you know?
No, the Mama
Yeah.
Garcia lived across the street from us. You know, all of her
Anyways,
kids are gone now, but, yeah, I never knew there was such a thing as race until I moved from Snyder to Houston, where I went to my first level of college. And then I had some real eye-awakening trauma as far as, the difference between living in a small town and a city. And I'm really grateful because I didn't have to deal with a lot of things
Right,
that our young people do today.
right,
I feel sad for each and every one of the generation that's coming up now,
right.
because they're having to deal with drugs, they're having to deal with education, they're dealing with alcohol, they're dealing with extended family and friends and neighbors who are sometimes extremely negative, and
Right.
other times you're blessed with a good positive neighbors and
Right.
community, as well as environment. And I think that's one thing that makes me angry and disappointed with our administration, our government, the laws that we are now living by
Right.
and are being backed up, or should I say, taken forward into a more negative atmosphere for our young people to face today.
Right.
I might have another 20 or 30 years to walk around down here, but in that time, I can see already now with this impeachment thing with Trump, that our laws are going to be such a challenge for our next generation, because they're making it so open. Unless the young people are going to hang on to those basic moral values
Right.
that they grew up with, they're done. They're done.
And the reality is that you had your experience, but somebody, maybe your neighbor, had a totally different experience where they assumed that the only good people were the people like them.
No, she had 6 boys.
Okay. And of course, this happened all over the South, where there was Jim Crow in the South. And because of that, these individuals assumed that only white people were good people. That was the message that they got. You didn't get that message
No.
in Snyder, but it's possible. I mean, I saw it all over the South. My wife is from Georgia. We were stationed in Mississippi. I saw it all over Mississippi.
Yeah, but the Triple K was there too. In those areas, we didn't have Triple K.
Well, congratulations.
I know.
But if they did, then they had that concept. I mean,
Yeah.
you're in an isolated community in West Texas, and there's nothing in West Texas. Snyder's just south of Lubbock, right?
98 miles
Yeah.
from where I lived.
just south of Lubbock.
Yeah, just a little, hey, it's closer to Gallup.
Yeah, well, it's still.
But we didn't have things like that back then.
What?
We didn't
KKK?
have- No, I'm talking about the crime and the challenges that people have today.
Yeah, well, and so they look back and they say, it's when we started letting so many aliens come in, so many immigrants come in. It's when we started letting gave African Americans the vote. Then we started having problems, and of course people, they interpret things the way they want to or the way that they see things, or the way that they're told by their parents. As long as white people were in charge, everything was great. Then when we started letting other people have power, and that's when everything got all screwed up.
My girlfriend in Florida says because of all the immigrants they're bringing in from the islands down there, in fact, the Florida school system throughout the state is now teaching Islam for history.
My son
Yeah,
teaches in.
that was a shocker to me too.
My son teaches in Fort Myers.
Does she? Does he?
He does, yeah.
Yeah, she lives in Palm Bay.
And he didn't say anything about it, but I'm assuming that it's not that strange to him. It's just a different religion.
Yeah, well, they're not supposed to teach religion in public school, so now they're
Well,
calling it
yeah, but you
history.
teach the history of religion. I mean,
Ah, that's how you do it, okay.
I mean, otherwise you can't teach history. If you don't talk about religion, you can't teach history. Because religion is part of history.
You know, major part.
Exactly. Possible solutions, giving the child option to say not sure. Of course, depending on how old they are, they need to say, well, I'm not exactly sure whether this individual is the right one or not. Instructions informing them of the importance of making a correct decision, decreased guessing, and the incidence of identifications. I've got something. Okay, wait a second. This is for Scott. I found these the other day, I forgot to give
Spoil
them.
him. He has the other one right by his bedside, so he remembers.
That's good. Yeah, well, now he's got both of them.
Okay.
And they said that you need to take them both, so.
Together?
Yeah, I don't know about the together part at the same time. Anyway, we'll see if it helps, just, no big deal. I don't know why I couldn't find it the first time. I couldn't find it. Most child sexual abuse cases rest solely on the words of the victim because these cases typically lack physical evidence. I mean, how often do you take your child to the doctor and have her sexual parts investigated? I mean, that just doesn't happen. Doctors normally don't do that. So potentially, even if she has bruising, even if she has problems in that area, that would be the only time you take her in to see the doctor. There are concerns about whether children can be trusted to provide accurate details and disclose experiences of abuse. This is the child that thinks that Barney's really alive, that their teddy bear can talk to them, that kind of thing. For that reason, a lot of times, what they have to say doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not as far as adults are concerned. We as adults, of course, we're focused on this. This is very important to us, to ourselves, of course. But to a child, this doesn't mean anything at all. Potentially, they could be sexually molested, and it doesn't impact them whatsoever. They have no memory of it. It's not important. What was important was the fact that they lost their teddy bear. That was important to them, but this is not something that's important. It's like trying to remember all your bowel movements. The only individual that remembers his bowel movements are Sheldon on television on Big Bang Theory. He keeps a log of his bowel movements. I mean, other than that, who even thinks about this kind of stuff? Well, as far as the child is concerned, it's no different. It's no different than a bowel movement. It's no different than urinating. It's just not that traumatic unless it's made traumatic by the individual. Or if they are told that they're not supposed to do this kind of thing. The first thing, if we're doing an investigative interview of a child, the first thing that we need to do is build rapport, and then encourage the children to provide details in their own words. And of course, this gets a little bit difficult because they don't have words for these things. So they probably do for their pee-pee, they probably call their sexual parts their pee-pee. But other than that, they just don't have the words. And they maybe they don't have very many words anyway, if they're that young. After this, investigators may ask specific questions about the event, although children are less accurate with specific questions. This structured protocol discourages the use of suggestive questions such as, "He touched you, didn't he?" Of course, that's a leading question. You're trying to get them to say yes. And of course, they'll say yes every time. Kids want to please you, so they will agree with anything that you have to say. So if you use leading questions, of course, you're leading them into giving you testimony that's inaccurate, unfortunately. When I was working at Fort Belknap, one of my students was finishing her program, but she had been a cop before, and this was her job. She was a little tiny thing, and so she was really good with kids, and she learned how to do this investigative interview. And of course, she was telling me that you can't lead at all. You can't even talk about these things. You have to get them to talk about them themselves. It has to come from them. It can't come from me. Then you take your clothes off. You can't say that. It's a leading question. You can't even talk about any of their physical being. You have to allow them to give you that information. So sometimes these interviews can take a long, long time. And of course, you guys have, 10 seconds of interest when you're on your telephone? So you can imagine how short their attention span is. Yes, ma'am.
In some cases that I'm aware of, the investigators will interview the child, determine whether there is a possibility or not, and if it's a definite possibility, even if they're hyperactive, they will allow that child to grow up and keep the case open until the child's a little bit older and able to verbalize what
Right,
happened.
and that makes sense. That's logical. But by that time, the child may have forgotten, of course.
Not when they're acting out.
Oh, they're acting out, okay. Then where did they learn that behavior? I guess that's the other question. you
Yeah,
have to
that's the
ask
next
yourself.
one.
Children are less accurate with specific versus general questions because specific questions ask for memories of events that the child may never have encoded or may have forgotten. And this is the problem. The child has to have encoded this information in their long-term memory. If it doesn't mean anything to them, then they don't remember it. It's like trying to remember a bowel movement. I'm using that as an example because, of course, that's something that people don't talk about. And of course, this is something else they don't talk about. How often do you urinate? That kind of thing. How, 5 days ago, did you have a bowel movement? And that would be the question that you'd be asking this child because it doesn't impact them. Potentially, it doesn't impact them. It's not that important. If it wasn't traumatizing, then they probably don't remember it. They just remember it as going outside and playing. What toys were you playing with? Those kinds of questions. And this is just not something that they remember. The child may answer a question that she or he does not fully understand in order to be cooperative. And of course, that's another problem. What nomenclature do you use? What words do you use? Does this have any meaning for the child? You may use a word, if you say the word penis, maybe he does not or she does not refer to the male appendage as a penis. Maybe they call it something else. So you have to determine what that word may potentially be before you can even ask a question dealing with that object. Specific questions can easily become suggestive, and that's the problem. So you can't ask them about penises. You can't, or whatever other word that you may choose to use for that. You can't, if you use the word vagina, is she going to understand what you're talking about? Probably not. A sizable number of children experience multiple incidents of sexual abuse. Repeated events enhance memory for what did we all learn yesterday? Besides Donald Trump may be impeached. What else did we learn yesterday? Oh, Demi Moore, her mother sold access to her when she was 15 years old. So here she is, a 15-year-old girl. There was a lot of stuff that came out about Demi Moore yesterday. I guess she just wrote a book, and evidently she's trying to sell the book. But her mother tried to commit suicide on numerous occasions, and she had to save her life. But at 15, her mother sold access to her to a wealthy older gentleman that I don't think she names in the book. I'm guessing she doesn't name the individual. What does that mean? That means that this man paid the mother a select amount of money so that he could potentially have sex with her. To whatever extent, I'm not exactly sure how that worked out. But I know, it was on CNN, and I tried to watch it to see what we were talking about, but it was just part of her interview with Diane Sawyer. So, didn't get very good information. So I really can't explain what was going on. But you can imagine a mother selling access to her 15-year-old daughter. And the other question was, and she asked her, Diane Sawyer asked her, was she prostituting you? And she said, no, I don't think she did. I don't think she understood what was going on. She didn't blame her mother for doing this, despite the fact that she was selling her. Anyway, fascinating question. I'm not going to buy the book. But if anybody finds out what was going on, please tell me. Maybe she'll have more interviews. And of course, in those interviews...
Just wait till it comes on Kindle or Amazon.
Oh, you mean the book? No, that's okay.
I know, right?
She also, well, we won't go into that. John Cryer, evidently, she thought she was John Cryer's first lover. John Cryer. He used to be on 2.5 Men.
From Pretty in Pink?
Pretty in Pink, yeah, Pretty in Pink. And actually, it was around that time that she evidently seduced him. And she seduced him, and she thought that she was sorry that she did it because she was more sexualized than he was. Anyway. And then John Cryer wrote back, no, I lost my virginity in high school. You know, you weren't my first one, but I'm sure that I seemed so unable to function that you thought you were my first one. I know, it's really kind of silly. And he said, I have only pleasant memories of it, so don't worry about it. He didn't traumatize me. Hollywood. I swear. Repeated events enhance memory for aspects of the incident that are held constant but impair the ability to recall details that vary. Prosecutors must provide evidence that reflect details of separate incidents in order to file multiple charges. So when we get multiple charges of child abuse, usually it's because the child has said this happened over and over and over again. Potentially it's not traumatizing. If it's not traumatizing, then probably it didn't impact the child very much. It's something that you don't remember. Just like you don't remember what toys you had when you were a child. You don't remember, I don't know, going out and playing. You don't remember these kinds of things. You don't remember everything that ever happened to you unless you're Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang Theory, and he theoretically has eidetic memory. There are people with eidetic memories. Who am I thinking of? Redheaded actress, Mary Lou Henner. Mary Lou Henner has an eidetic memory. She remembers everything. She remembers all of her lines from all of the movies and television shows she's ever been in. As weird as that.
What kind of memory?
Eidetic. It means
Eidetic.
Eidetic. It means you remember everything. Can you imagine having all that stuff clogging up your brain? Geez, I can't remember yesterday.
It's like that Netflix show again. There's people, they memorize this huge like list of numbers.
Oh,
They
I
just
saw
look
that.
at it real quick and then they put it down and they can say like all the numbers.
I didn't remember.
I can't even remember phone numbers. I don't know how they do that.
Does your brain make room for new memories? Does it replace a memory with a memory that,
Does it make room? It doesn't have to. Your memory is selective.
so it only stores what is most significant?
What's important, exactly. Hopefully this is, whatever I'm talking about is significant as far as you're concerned.
Yeah.
I know, but sometimes.
10 o'clock?
Yeah, I mean, is it 10? Okay. Those of you who want to go talk to,
Start fighting.
don't hurt him.
I'm joking.
Don't hurt him, he's nice. Well, maybe he's not nice, but. Okay.
Will be nice. when you can talk.
Don't make it. Good luck. I hope everything turns out okay. I have to go talk to him too, so. And you can say all the mean things you want about me if you like, that's okay.
Are you looking for a new vacation spot?
I have a vacation spot. It's nice and green up there.
Call home with a big barn.
It's called home with the big barn, exactly. With no barn door at this point.
So you're gonna do it over Thanksgiving break?
What, put the barn door back on? It weighs 500 pounds, I can't lift it. Okay.
What, no neighbors?
No neighbors? No, I've got, my neighbor to the south is a half a mile down the road. My neighbor to the north is a half mile down the road. And it's east and west, it's all fields.
Oh, you're lucky.
If they experience multiple incidents of maltreatment, children may be subjected to repeated interviews. Research has shown both negative and positive effects of repeated interviews on children's memory and suggestibility. And of course, if we're not careful, this can become more traumatizing than whatever else happened to you. Than the sexual molestation. The fact that people keep talking about it. That can be more traumatizing than the actual event.
This is what I was talking about yesterday with that show, When They See Us. They keep pressing to the kids about trying to get information out of them about what they're
Exactly.
that incident.
And then suddenly it's traumatizing. They were okay before, and
Yeah.
now all of a sudden they're traumatized. So you gotta be careful that this doesn't happen. The reminiscence effect can explain why multiple interviews might be useful. Every time something new will come out, hopefully that it's not memories that they are just filling in. Of course, we do that all the time. We remember our little pieces of things, and then all of a sudden you're filling these things in. I fell out of a helicopter one time. I landed on my shoulders, and I kind of hit the back of my head. I don't remember a whole lot from it, but in time, with people telling me what happened, and with being in the hospital, and all this stuff, I've filled in all that stuff. I remember, I think I do anyway. I fell out, and I did a somersault. Otherwise, I was going to land on my face, and I did a somersault, so I landed on my shoulders. I know. And if I remember correctly, I was headed towards something really hard, like the ground. I mean, the ground is hard. But I was able to move over so that I landed on a tuft of grass, and it was a big tuft of grass. Anyway. But I probably filled all that stuff in. Right after it happened, I didn't remember anything. I was in the hospital. So, yeah. We fill things in, and people tell us stories, we see pictures, and then we remember, or we think that we remember because we see the pictures, and then we kind of fill in the background, we fill in the sides. We fill in what happened 15 minutes before, 15 minutes afterwards. The reality may be I don't even remember getting into the helicopter. I may not remember that. But I filled it all in because I filled it in with other incidences where I was getting into a helicopter. But I don't know. I mean, I landed on my head. I could have done a lot of damage to myself, but luckily I landed on a tuft of grass. When I say tuft of grass, I mean it was elephant grass. So it was really thick grass. I didn't have a concussion. It just knocked me out. I did stop breathing.
Well, that's all.
I stopped breathing, so they landed and they picked me up. And when he picked me up, he thought I was dead. Well, I wasn't breathing. And he picked me up and he threw, I only weighed 117 pounds. He picked me up by my flak jacket and threw me into the helicopter. And when I hit, I started breathing again. You know, it was one of those kind of deals. And so I've heard this story, but it may be that I don't remember any of this stuff at all. I mean, I was unconscious. I was dead. So do I remember it, or do I remember what they told me? You know, that's kind of an interesting question. I took like 37 flights on helicopters, and I can't tell you, we got shot down, I don't know, well, the helicopter wasn't flying at the end of the mission like 5 times, so I remember those. Those were really traumatic. But I don't remember hardly anything else. I mean, geez, can you remember everything? Can you remember where you were going? Can you remember picking people up? Can you remember trying to help people that were wounded? Nah. Oops. Okay, this girl's only 14 years old. She's making fish sticks. Isn't that what that's called? Is that a kissy face? I don't know. Anyway, she's making a fish face. 14-year-old girl informed her mother that the mother's former partner had sexually assaulted her. There was evidence that the young girl was telling the truth. She was not a virgin. That's about the only way that you can tell that something has happened. An interview with the girl using open-ended questions disclosed 3 separate episodes of abuse. A second interview disclosed another episode and more corroborating details. A lot of times we repress this information. And since we are repressing this information, as I may be doing with my helicopter story, there's a possibility that it didn't happen the way that I was told that it happened. I don't remember being pushed out of the helicopter, but the door gunner elbowed me. I was holding on. I grabbed a hold of the strap because we were taking evasive actions, and I grabbed a hold of his strap. And at that point, he elbowed me and he knocked me out of the helicopter. Helicopters. The blades are spinning around, and it creates a suction, and it's really hard. You're going against the wind if you go outside the helicopter, unless they slow the blades down. That's why you can get in and out of a helicopter when it's on the ground, because blades aren't going around very fast. Obviously, they're not going around very fast because you're on the ground, okay? But when you're up in the air and those blades are the only thing that's keeping you in the helicopter, there's a degree of suction going on. There's a wall of wind. So you can lean against it. It's pretty strong. But this guy hit me and he knocked me out of the helicopter. And I didn't hit anything on my way down. I mean, there's pontoons sitting there, and they're out about this far. But I didn't hit him. So he hit me hard enough that I flew out of the helicopter, and I missed the. Okay. Anyway, so what are we talking about? Okay, second and third episodes. So she initially remembered that she'd been molested a couple of times, and then when they interviewed her, they were able to determine that she'd been molested a couple more times. Repeated interviewing is necessary when an alleged victim is too distressed to provide useful information initially, when victims fail to disclose abuse that is later documented by medical examinations or suspect confessions, or when other new evidence comes to light. So we know that this happened. A lot of times we repress this information. We don't want to think about this stuff. So we repress it. We forget that it happened. And it's possible to force yourself to forget things. Children are sometimes reluctant to disclose abusive experiences and may even deny them when they are asked. Research does suggest that many children can remember significant details of abuse experiences and, if asked directly, can describe them quite accurately. But these are children with verbal skills. These are children after the age of 6. These are not children before the age of 6. Before the age of 6, Barney is a living creature. Why am I using Barney? He's not even on television anymore. Who's somebody that's on television now? The Wildcrats. My grandson is just he's just enamored with the Wildcrats. They turn into animals. They put a power disc on their chest and they turn into, I've seen every episode that these guys have made, these two crazy Canadians, Chris and what's the other guy's name? I can't think of the other guy's name. Anyway, Wildcrats. So they think all this stuff is real, and my grandson, of course, has a teddy bear that he thinks is alive, you know, just like the cat. Sometimes he pets the teddy bear instead of the cat. He treats the cat like it was a stuffed animal, and he treats the stuffed animal like it was a living animal. A subgroup of abuse victims either forget abuse or remembers it poorly. Why in the world is this true? People who cope with maltreatment by trying to suppress, inhibit, or ignore their thoughts about it may weaken or even eliminate memories of those experiences over time. So if you don't think about these things, they kind of degenerate. They go away, which is a good thing. The other day I made a mistake. I called somebody by the wrong name. And I was appalled. This really bugs me. You know, I want to be perfect, okay? I don't want to call somebody by the wrong name. I probably called Harley Haley the other day. That would have killed me. Just leaving the R out of your name, it would have killed me. But, and that happened on Thursday, and so it bugged me on Thursday. Friday, it still was in my memory. By Saturday, I'd forgotten all about it. Now I don't feel so bad. But bringing it up, now I feel bad about it. Did I call you Haley the other day? I don't think so. I think I told you.
I don't even remember yesterday.
You never listen to what I say. Probably called you Charlie or something. Anyway, so so we try to forget these things. We forget about our bad stuff, and that's I have the ability to do this. I worked in the hospital for decades. I saw the worst stuff you can possibly imagine. I watched hundreds of people die, thousands of people. I checked thousands of bodies into the morgue. Don't remember any of it. Don't remember names, don't remember. I only remember, and I tell you sometimes, I tell you the stories, those were only the ones that made an impression on me. If they didn't, I just forgot them. I remember the time they did surgery on this lady. She had so much fat on her inner thorax that they decided she was dying from congestive heart failure. So they decided they were going to take it off. So they did surgery and they pulled all this fat off of the front of her. And of course, it's lots. They brought it down on a stretcher, 100 pounds of fat. You can imagine what it smelled like. Fat is not the best smelling stuff in the world. Human fat, of course, has a lot of fat in it, but it also has sugar in it. We eat a lot of crappy food. And this fat was, oh man, what a smell. And they had to isolate. Of course I remember that, because the smell was so extreme. And the fact that it looked like
they had just butchered, 1,000 chickens and taken all the fat and just go out and they piled it up. That's what it looked like. It looked like chicken fat, that yellow stuff. If you've ever, do you know anything about chickens? Have you ever butchered anything?
I'm just imagining stuff I've seen from horror movies.
It was a horror movie, all right. And they brought it down on a stretcher. It was, I don't know why they didn't roll it in, they could have put it on a gurney and just rolled it down, but no, it was on a stretcher. And I'm not exactly sure why. Anyway, it was on a stretcher and they took it back to back to pathology. So this guy had to finger his way through all this, through 100 pounds of fat. I know, to find out if there's anything in it. Ugh.
Remember that the next time you do not take the skin off the chicken. Because underneath that skin, all that slimy yellow stuff is nothing but fat.
That's fat, and she had 100 pounds of it. Our pathologist liked donuts, and he ate donuts for like every meal. So every time you talked to him, he had donut breath, which is not the best smelling stuff in the world. Anyway, so you could, if you talked to him, you had to talk to him from here to there. You didn't want to get any close enough to be able to smell his breath, or he'd knock you over.
Oh, give me garlic any day.
Yeah, garlic's not nearly as bad as donut stink. Oh, man. Though, yeah, he's probably out there watching all my videos to see if I say anything. No, he's 100 years old, what am I doing? Though most child maltreatment cases end in admissions of guilt or plea bargains, tens of thousands of children, often preschoolers, must testify at abuse trials each year. It is a tragedy that all this is taking place to begin with, but they have to testify.
Why do they have to put the kids into a courtroom?
Because that's the only proof that they have.
Yeah, but can't they do videos? And
Well, that's what we're going to
ask
talk about in a minute.
questions
It all
and-
depends on the state and it all depends on the judge.
more child abuse.
It all depends on the state and it all depends on the judge. Who was I talking to? Oh, Jeremiah. He was talking about an individual, a judge in this area that doesn't believe in child abuse.
What?
Doesn't believe in child abuse, so he demands all of this evidence before he'll convict somebody. So a lot of people get off just because the judge won't accept select pieces of evidence as evidence.
From Arizona?
I'm sorry?
From Arizona?
He said it's in this area, and yeah, he has only been in Arizona. He hasn't dealt with anybody in New Mexico, so I'm guessing it's somebody from Arizona.
Is it somebody on the res?
I have no idea. He wouldn't mention the name, and I didn't ask.
The location would help.
See, you want to know. You're just
Yes,
looking
you're
for-
right. I'm the
You're just
curious.
looking for gossip, that's all.
No, actually, I'm not a gossip person. I just want to know what area not to live in.
What is the effect on the child of having to discuss these issues in court? Talking about victimization in a public setting may increase the trauma for many children, although it may be traumatic for some, not traumatic for some, but more traumatic for others. And yes, it is a form of child abuse, unfortunately. And not only that, but they have to go over their testimony over and over and over again. So they're re-traumatizing them every time they talk about this incident, as sad as this is. And actually, this judge doesn't believe, he doesn't like children to testify in his court. So for that reason, a lot of these individuals just get off because he won't have the children testify. So it's not child abuse. He won't allow them to be re-traumatized so that we can convict these people. That's the problem.
Oh, he's protecting the pedophile.
Well, potentially, well, he says that he's protecting the child.
Okay?
Okay. How do jurors perceive child witnesses? In mock jury studies, child eyewitnesses are generally viewed as less credible than adult eyewitnesses. But in child sexual abuse cases, younger victims are viewed as more credible than adolescents or adults, probably because jurors suspect that younger children lack the sexual knowledge to fabricate an allegation.
Note that jurors can recognize the effects of suggestive questioning. And of course, that happens all the time as well. Judges allow various courtroom modifications to protect children from the potential stress of testifying. It is always very traumatic when you face your accuser, or the accuser is in the courtroom. So they're looking at you. This is somebody that has done something horrible to you, and now you have to face them again. It's very traumatizing. So if somebody were raped, if somebody were physically assaulted, potentially they're being re-traumatized when they have to deal with this individual. The placement of a screen in front of the defendant has been used so that a child witness cannot see him or her while testifying. The Supreme Court later ruled that the defendant's rights to confront the accuser was not outweighed by the necessity of protecting the victims of sexual abuse. And this is a case called Coy versus Iowa in 1988. What happened was the child could not testify if they saw the person's face. It was the child's father, and the child's father had molested them. And they gave all of this testimony, but they needed to give it in court. But when they saw their parents' face, they weren't able to testify. So and it went all the way to the Supreme Court because they weren't going to do anything. The state of Iowa couldn't do anything because they didn't have the evidence to convict this individual. They didn't have the evidence to convict him because the child wouldn't testify in court. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decided they could testify in a different manner. And that was in 1988.
So does that stand in most states now?
Yes, it's a Supreme Court decision.
Okay, so it's blanketed throughout the whole US, right?
Potentially.
Okay, answered my question.
Yeah, potentially.